Hi everybody, welcome back to Ivy Tutoring's ACT prep course. I'm Caden. Hopefully you can see me in the bottom corner of the screen. If you watched the previous video, you know it was just a video recording and my voice speaking over explaining what I was doing. I did get some feedback from that video and found out that students wanted to actually see me in order to engage a little bit better with the content. So after a couple of days of tinkering with software, fixing the audio settings on the new software I'm using. Hopefully you're able to see me in the bottom corner, and hopefully it makes it a little bit more engaging for all the students, that are involved in working on this lesson plan. So yeah, those are the kind of the changes between the previous video and today's video. Hopefully you can see my screen as well. Let's talk about briefly what we're going to be doing in today's video. This video, if you remember what we talked about last time, is lesson 2. Last time we talked about major strategies overall for all of the sections on the ACT and what the ACT is about in general. Today we're going to be doing our first focus video, and it's going to be focused on the English section of the exam. Okay, so lesson 2 and 3, if you remember, are going to be focused on the English section. Today's video specifically, we're going to be going through what we call the SAT and ACT grammar and punctuation packet. Basically, what it contains is all of the information, all of the grammar rules, all of the punctuation rules, everything involved with the English grammar and the actual rules and language that you need to know for the ACT, right? A lot of students have seen many of these before, but aren't super familiar with them because they're not really emphasized in, high school English classes. You might have seen them in middle school English classes or maybe early high school, but once you get to be like a junior and senior in high school or around that age, you probably haven't seen these same exact rules recently. So we're going to be covering them. We're going to be talking about how they're applied on the ACT, how you're going to see them, how questions actually show up like them. And we're basically just going to spend all of today's video going through the 15-page or so packet that will cover all of that pertinent information. And then the next video, if you want to skip to lesson 3 and you've already watched this video or you've already reviewed the grammar packet, lesson 3 is going to be me actually applying these grammar rules on an actual ACT English test. So lesson 3, we're going to be going through an entire English test together, and then I'll be working through it using the grammar rules, using context from the actual passages, all the things that you needed to be doing in your actual ACT practice. So today's video, like I said, reviewing the ACT grammar and punctuation packet. So let's get right into it, okay? Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. I'm zooming in. There we go. It looks like you can. Perfect. Okay. So this is the very first page. If you haven't seen this before, all of this information, this entire resource packet is in the Ivy Resources Google Drive that you should have been sent by Ivy Tutoring themselves, right? So you should have been sent this information, this packet as well. It's about 14 pages long, right? And basically what it does is it goes through all of the punctuation and grammar that you need to know on the ACT. And a lot of students I've noticed, I've worked through this with all of my one-on-one students, all of my classes, right? And the biggest thing I've noticed is that when students read them themselves, right, they're not really applying them well. So the first thing I do want to preface this is we're going to talk about how to use these things more than the rule themselves, right? We're going to focus on how you're actually using these specific rules and then how to apply them on an ACT question or an ACT test, right? So let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to focus on is punctuation, okay? So basically, we're going to go through the most common, the most used types of punctuation that the ACT tests you on. And the first of those things is the apostrophe. All of you have definitely used apostrophes in the past, heard of what an apostrophe is, but let's talk about all the rules and exceptions that go along with apostrophes. Okay, so apostrophes, their primary, objective, they do two major things, right? First, they indicate possession, right? So for a noun like Caden, that's my name, if I wanted to say Caden's car, like I own the car, I would put an apostrophe S, right? Caden is singular, I'm one person, right? And if I wanted to own a car, right, have possession of the car, I would say Caden's car with an apostrophe S at the end. So that's a pretty simple use of apostrophes. You've seen this before. That's with singular nouns, right? Now with plural nouns, right, you always want to add an S plus an apostrophe, instead of an apostrophe S. So Caden's car, Caden is singular, right? But if I wanted to use, I don't know, the word cars, right? And I'm referring to the cars themselves. This is a group of cars. Say I go to a dealership, right? And I'm referring to all of the cars in the dealership lot, right? If I wanted to say the cars paint jobs, right? So they all have individual different paint jobs, right? And I wanted to refer to their paint jobs, what I would do is take the word cars and just put an apostrophe at the end. You don't want to put cars apostrophe S, right? Because this is implying plural. This implies possessiveness. And then this doesn't really do anything once the noun is already plural, right? So we don't really want to have, a, an S and then an apostrophe and then S when the first S indicates that the noun was plural, right? So if I was talking about cars, the cars paint job, you don't want to have that extra S, right? So it's just the apostrophe after the S. So you've probably seen apostrophes come before an S and apostrophe coming after an S, right? So the ones before the S indicate that the word is singular. The ones after the S indicate that the word is plural. Here I'm referring to Caden, singular. Here I'm referring to cars, many cars, plural cars. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between proper nouns, regular nouns, and their apostrophe usages. Okay, but we also have to talk about pronouns. Okay, so this is usually what students get tripped up on a lot. And I should preface this whole video by saying you'll probably notice that I am going through this thing, going to kind of hit the major points. There are a couple of small things that you should definitely review and look into, which is like the difference between a word ending in an S or an ES. Basically just put an apostrophe after the ES, nothing crazy there. I'm not going to repeat everything that is in this grammar packet because that would kind of be a waste of time for you, right? We're just going to be going over the most important things, things that students get incorrect the most that I've seen in the past, right? So let's keep going. Pronouns, basically apostrophes with nouns or proper nouns work just like we just discussed, right? If you want to apply possession, you put an apostrophe. Pronouns, that's not the case, right? With pronouns, you do not want an apostrophe for possessiveness, okay? So if I said, the can's wrapper, okay, so the wrapper on a can, right? This is singular, apostrophe S. That's a noun. That's totally fine. The can's wrapper, right? And then what if I'm referring to this can and I say its color is red? Its color is red. Now, there's something wrong with this because although we had an apostrophe here with proper nouns or with regular nouns, right? That's totally fine. We need the apostrophe to apply possession on a noun. But on a pronoun, we do not want an apostrophe, right? So on a pronoun, when we're trying to show possession, we do not want the apostrophe. So this would be the correct format of this sentence, right? Its color is red with no apostrophe on the its. Okay. What an apostrophe does on an its is this is the same thing as it is. Okay, so that shows it's a contraction, right? So whenever you have a pronoun with an apostrophe, the apostrophe signals a contraction, a combination of two words, like it is, they are, that kind of thing. Okay. So whenever you have an apostrophe, it is not possessive with a pronoun, right? It's a contraction. Remember that. Okay. A lot of students get tripped up on this. It's different than what a noun works like, right? Pronouns are different than nouns. Okay. It's with no apostrophe shows possession, right? So it's the opposite of a noun, right? No apostrophe now shows possession. Apostrophe shows contraction. Okay. Make sure you don't accidentally pick an answer choice that has something like this or like this. Those two don't exist, right? Just make sure you understand that you should never be putting an apostrophe after the S on a pronoun, right? On an it's, because apostrophe after the S implies that the word is plural. Remember, we talked about that with the cars apostrophe, right? But it plural is not its, right? That's not the plural of it. The plural of it is actually they, right? So we're actually going to use they in our next example here with these pronouns, they, their, that kind of thing, right? If we want to show they are, right, we would use they apostrophe are as a contraction, right? Remember, if we're using contractions on a pronoun, that's when we use an apostrophe, okay? So there's three types of theirs. You've probably seen these before. Probably don't have to go through them that much. But with the apostrophe is the contraction. This, there, THEIR, that's possession, right? Just the same as its, right? Plural of its, okay? And then THERE, that's kind of the basic one that, everybody kind of thinks about when you think about the word there. It's talking about a place over there, right? A location, okay? So those are, the three kind of major forms of there, okay? And here's some examples if you want to look through them briefly. We won't be going through them because it takes a little bit too much time for us. Okay. But then there's a pronoun, another pronoun that we have to worry about, who versus whose, okay? Or whose versus whose, I suppose, okay? So what are the two different types of whose and when do we use them? Well, sticking with the same kind of pronoun apostrophe theme, whenever there's an apostrophe, it implies a contraction on a pronoun. So whose with an apostrophe is who is, right? Who's going to the party? Who is going to the party? That's the kind of thing that we're working with here, right? But whose, this WHOSE, that's the possession one, right? So whose sweater is this? If I found a sweater on the chair, right, at a party or something like that, okay? So whose sweater is this? Whose this one implies possession, okay? A couple of good examples down here, right? Barbara McClintock is a scientist whose discovery of jumping genes helped her earn the 1983 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Okay, so whose describes that it was Barbara McClintock's actual discovery, right? It was her discovery. Okay. Note. This is actually an important note that I do see come up, and students get it something with like this wrong fairly often. Okay. But note that whose, WHOSE, unlike who, the singular, can be used for both people and things and places. So if I wanted to say whose, or if I wanted to say who, right? If I wanted to say who refers to only a person, right? If I say the word who, I'm talking about a person, or I'm referring to a person, or I'm asking for a person, right? If I wanted to ask for a thing or a place, I would say which, or what, or where, something like that. Who refers to people. Which, what, or where, those kind of things refer to places or things, right? Or objects, not people. However, whose is kind of a plural of all of these words, right? Whose is the possession form, but it can refer to either a person possessing something else, or a place possessing something else, or an object possessing something, or a thing possessing something, right? For example, London is a city whose many museums, palaces, and monuments make it a popular tourist destination, right? Whose is referring to London as a city, not a person, right? That's a city, that's a place, but whose can refer to both people and places and things, right? Whereas who is just used for people, okay? So keep that in mind. Usually doesn't show up that often on the ACT, but definitely has come up, and I've seen students get tripped up on it. So make sure you keep that in mind, okay? Okay. Next part of the grammar and punctuation packet is semicolons and periods. Okay, I really like semicolons and periods because they're very simple, right? Once you get to know them a little bit. Because a semicolon is exactly the same as a period. And I'm willing to bet almost everybody who's going to watch this video knows how a period works, right? Periods end sentences. That's basically their only job, okay? But semicolons and periods are used between two complete sentences. They function exactly the same, right? If I put a period here, the sentences would still make sense, right? London is an old city. It has many new buildings, okay? I can use either a semicolon between those two independent clauses or a period, right? Either way, as long as the two sides can stand on their own, you can put a semicolon or a period between them, okay? The next thing that you need to talk about is semicolons and periods can be used before conjunctive adverbs, okay? So conjunctive adverbs are basically words like however, moreover, and therefore, right? And it's basically adverbs that link two ideas together and kind of exercise or demonstrate their correlation, right? However, I like to call it is a contradictory conjunctive adverb, right? If I say one thing, right, and then I want to say something else that's a little bit different or contradictory to the first thing, I can put however between them to connect them, right? Make it very clear to my audience that the relationship between these two things is not abundantly clear. It doesn't seem like those two things would make sense, right? For example, London is an old city. However, it has many new buildings, okay? London's an old city. if the city is old, you'd expect it to have many old buildings, right? But the next thing we're saying is it has many new buildings, right? So these two things, although they can both be true, that's certainly fine, right? A lot of people might think that's a little bit weird, right? Might find some, intrigue in that fact. Well, it's old, but it has new buildings. Okay, so those are contradictory in some way. How do I describe that relationship? Well, I could just put a period or a semicolon. But if I want to actually make that, explicit, that I understand that these two things are contradictory, I could say something like semicolon or period, however. London is an old city. However, it has many new buildings, right? There's one thing, and then however, and then the contradictory thing, okay? And then you could use that same kind of logic with therefore, if, instead of being contradictory, we are talking about, some things that are complementary, right? For example, London is an old city, semicolon, therefore, it has a rich history. Right? Because it's very old, it has this kind of very strong history, right? A very rich history. Okay, and that makes sense, right? Because you would expect the older cities to have more history and culture in them than the newer cities, right? Because those two things are very correlated, very complementary, right? We wouldn't use however there, we would use therefore. Okay, this same kind of idea shows up a lot with, ACT questions, right? Where students are, need to pick the correct word that describes the relationship between two, independent clauses or phrases or anything like that. It shows up a lot, and students get it wrong a lot. So be very careful about understanding how each of these words is used, right? Moreover, however, is used for contradiction. Moreover is used kind of for, you say one thing and then you say another thing that adds on to that first thing, right? Moreover is, that kind of relationship. And then therefore is, one thing X is said, and then because thing X is true, thing X implies thing Y, that you then say thing Y, right? So there's three different relationships there, and you're always going to be able to select the right one based on the context of what they're discussing on either side of the adverb, okay? These do show up a lot, so be careful with that, okay? Okay. This important note, this is important. We did discuss this in the previous video, but it's always good to reiterate it. Always read the entire sentence whenever you're doing a ACT English test, right? So always read the whole sentence. This is because you need the whole sentence to understand, one, the context of what's going on, how to pick the correct answer. But two, grammar changes on a sentence level, right? It doesn't change on a phrase level. It changes on the level of the whole sentence. So if something is different about the beginning of the sentence or the end of the sentence, that changes the grammar, the structure of the grammar in the entire sentence. So basically, if you only read, where the actual answer choice is, you might make an assumption that is not true about the rest of the sentence. Okay, so I cannot make this any more clear. Read the whole sentence when you're picking an answer, right? When you're trying to figure out which is the correct answer. Okay, read the whole sentence. So that's kind of one big thing. So we've gone through, semicolons and periods now. And now we've actually reached probably the hardest part of the English grammar and punctuation packet. And on the ACT, this is the thing that trips most students up, right? It's commas. It's when to use commas. Because a lot of the time, commas just feel like you're going off vibes, right? It feels like, oh, there should be a break here, so we should put a comma, right? But there's actual rules that govern when we use commas, okay? And there's a lot of rules, so stick with me as we go through these. And the more and more you use these rules, right, at first you're going to have to try to memorize them. At first you're going to have to try to remember, okay, what is this rule? What do I have to do here? Comma or no comma, okay? But over time, it's just going to become more of a feeling, right? When I take an ACT test or when I'm doing a question, right, I no longer think about the rules actively, right? But they've become ingrained in me over time because I've done so many ACT practice tests, right? And that's kind of the goal for all ACT students just like you. Okay, so just do as many practice questions as you can with these commas, right? And eventually these rules will become ingrained. But for now, you need a base of what the rules are. So let's go through them. There's about 14 of them. Okay, number one. Before a coordinating conjunction to join two full sentences, you should use a comma. So basically, there's three major ways to join two sentences. You could put a period, right? You could also put a semicolon because we said those two are equal. Or you could put a comma and what is known as a fanboy, something like and, right? So if I wanted to connect two sentences, right? London is a very old city, and it is very appealing to tourists as a result. Okay? It is very appealing to tourists as a result. That can stand on its own, right? If I said that to you, that's perfectly fine, right? London is a very old city. If I said that to you, perfectly fine. Those are two independent clauses, right? But to connect them, if we don't want to make a completely separate sentence and don't want to use a semicolon, what we do is we have to put a comma and then what is known as a fanboy, one of these fanboys. Because this is kind of the mnemonic for and, nor, but, or yet so. You might have seen this in English class before. But these are the 7 words that can be used to connect complete sentences or connect independent clauses, okay? As long as they're used in conjunction with a comma. Do not just put and, right? You can't just put and between two independent clauses, right? Don't put just a comma, right? Because commas can't separate independent clauses on their own. You need both of these together, right? This is the only correct way to use a comma or a coordinating conjunction to, put independent clauses together, okay? All right. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2. You can use commas between a dependent clause and an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. Let's talk about what that means. First of all, what is a dependent clause? Dependent clause is just a clause that can't stand on its own, right? If you say it, it's implying that you're about to say something else. And if you said it on its own, it would sound weird in some way, right? For example, because I went home. If I said that to you, you'd expect me to explain something that comes after that fact, right? When we visited Chicago, right? That's a dependent clause, right? You can't just say when we visited Chicago. You expect there to be something coming after it, okay? They all begin with what are called subordinating conjunctions, right? Basically describing context for the independent clause, right? Because this thing happened, or when this thing happened, or until something happens. They're basically describing a changed state, right? Or a state of being, right? Because I went home, because my state was being at home, X thing happened. Or when we visited Chicago, when we were in Chicago, Y thing happened, okay? So a dependent clause describes these kind of states, right? So with dependent clauses, the comma rule we're actually getting to is when you put a dependent clause, you must put a comma and then have the independent clause afterwards, right? So if you have a dependent clause, because I went home, I didn't get to see my friends. Okay, because I went home, I didn't get to see my friends. This, I didn't get to see my friends, that's an independent clause, independent, can stand on its own. If I just said, I didn't get to see my friends, that's a complete sentence, okay? I can say that, right? But if I wanted to give a reason for why I couldn't see my friends, right? Because I went home, I didn't get to see my friends. I have to put a comma separating that dependent clause in the beginning from the independent clause in the end, okay? That's rule number 2, okay? Rule number 3, around non-essential words and phrases, right? Around non-essential words and phrases. What is a non-essential word or phrase? Well, it's basically a clause that can be removed from the sentence and the sentence maintains its essential meaning, right? For example, London, which is a very old city, has some extremely modern parts. If I cut out, which is a very old city, the main point of the sentence, right, is that London has some extremely modern parts, right? So if I cut this sentence out, right, I'm not losing the essential meaning of this sentence, right? But non-essential phrases usually add some extra information. It's usually superfluous in some way. You don't really need it, right? It just might add a little bit of context to what you're saying. But if you take it out, it's totally fine. The people listening will still get the essential meaning of the sentence, right? London has some extremely modern parts. Okay, so whenever we come across one of these non-essential phrases, right, which is a very old city, we need to put commas around it. We need to separate the sentence, right, from the non-essential information with commas. Okay, basically adding a barricade around this non-essential information so that if you look outside of the barricade, the sentence still makes sense. Okay, so always put commas around non-essential information. Okay, the same kind of rule applies to single words that are non-essential, right? If I say, London's a very old city, period. It does, however, have some very modern parts. This, however, implies that contradiction that we talked about earlier, that contradictory nature of the word however, right? Between very old city, very modern parts, those are contradictory, so we use however. But if I take out the word however, right, completely eliminate it, take it out, I could say London is a very old city. It does have some very modern parts. The main essential details of the sentence are there. I got the same factual information. I got the same necessary information. But I kind of lost, the author is no longer making it very clear that these two are, contradictory. That's not the main essential part of the sentence, right? The main part is that have these, modern parts in London, right? But this is a non-essential phrase, and once we say it's a non-essential word or phrase, right, we need to separate it with commas. So we need to separate out the word however with commas, okay? Okay, use number 4 for commas. This is one that you've definitely seen before. It's to separate items in a list. Basically, whenever we have a list of, grocery items that we're saying, or, activities, something like that, we always have to separate them with commas when we have a list of more than 2 things, right? Hiking, skiing, and whitewater rafting have always been some of my favorites. Okay, or my favorite activities. We have hiking, skiing, whitewater rafting, so we need to put commas. Okay, one thing I should note is that the Oxford comma, basically the comma that comes before and, this one, right, it's not necessary, right? I think the ACT does like to use it, right? The ACT uses the Oxford comma. However, if you see something without the Oxford comma, that is not the thing that's going to make the answer choice wrong, okay? So with no Oxford comma is totally fine. Usually you will see the correct answer with an Oxford comma, but if you see something without an Oxford comma and everything else is correct, that answer is still correct, okay? So don't use that to rule something out. Okay, and then finally, to separate adjectives whose order could be reversed. Okay, let's talk about what that means. If in this example, right, the groaning, rumbling train finally pulled into the station. If I switch the words groaning and rumbling, they're both describing the train independently, right? They're describing the noises the train's making, right? So we can switch those two and the sentence still keeps its exact meaning, right? And if we can't switch the two adjectives, right, we need to put a comma between those adjectives, basically implying that they're equals, okay? Now, you might be thinking, well, when can we not switch the adjectives, right? Let's say, for example, I'm saying the white coral reef is dying. That sentence, right? The white coral reef is dying. Reef is a noun. The adjectives that describe the noun are coral and white. If we switch these two, and I said the coral white reef is dying, that doesn't make much sense because coral reef is the name of the actual type of reef. White is describing the coral reef, right? So white must come first here, and it's describing this whole thing, coral reef, whereas coral is just describing the reef. Okay, so this order is necessary. We can't switch white and coral here. So what this means is we do not put a comma between white and coral, right? So whenever the adjectives have a specific hierarchy in which we need to put one in one order and the other afterwards, right? We do not put commas to separate them, okay? And this will show up again, but we'll talk about it right now, okay? Okay. So those are the 5 major places that commas should be used, okay? The ACT, this grammar packet also has a group of places where commas should not be used, right? These are the 9 most common places that students accidentally put commas or put commas even though, they're not supposed to be there, right? And these are 9 times that we definitely have to discuss because they show up a lot, right? That's kind of our major goal here, right? So yeah, let's go through these. Commas should not be used between 2 full sentences. A comma is not a period, right? It's also not a semicolon, right? So a comma is not a period or a semicolon. So we have to be careful here, right? We cannot just say, London is a very old city, comma, it has some extremely modern parts. This is wrong, right? Because this comma by itself can't sit there. Now, if you remember back, what can we use with a comma to separate 2 independent clauses, to separate 2 sentences? We can use a comma and a fanboy, like comma and or comma but. Okay, so those are totally fine, but a comma by itself cannot separate independent clauses. Okay. The second thing is you can't separate 2 clauses with the same subject when the subject is not repeated. What is this saying? Okay, let's look at our example. London is a very old city, but has many modern buildings. So London is the subject. London is a very old city. but has many modern buildings. So we have two clauses here, right? One with the verb is and one with the word has, right? London is a very old city, and London has many modern buildings, okay? And we can never separate subjects from verbs with a comma, right? This is actually number 3, so they probably should have switched this order here. But one of the things is we can never separate subjects and their verbs, okay, with commas. So if has is a verb to London, right, we can't put a comma between London and has, right? So we never separate subject and verb with commas. I should put a caveat on that and say if there's non-essential information somewhere between the subject and the verb, then you need to separate out that non-essential information, right? But you should never have a single comma between the verb and its subject, okay? So that kind of covers number 2 and number 3 together, okay? So that's number 2 and number 3. Number 4 is between compound elements. Basically, if you have multiple nouns or multiple verbs being talked about in the same clause, right, you don't want to separate them with a comma, right? You want to say, many tourists travel to London and Paris to visit museums and monuments. You don't put a comma before that, okay? This one's also pretty self-explanatory. Students usually don't get this one wrong, but never put a comma between compound verbs or nouns, okay? You also never want to put a comma before or after a preposition. It's come to my attention a lot of people don't know what prepositions actually are. So here's a couple common examples: of, to, by, from, about, with, in, on, at. They're basically words that describe location or time or place, right? They're giving a little bit of context, right? They begin a phrase that describes location or time, right? For example, of Latin American origin. That's describing the place that somebody is born, right? Of is, describing, where that person was, or, what kind of origin that person has, okay? So these types of prepositions, there's a lot of them. I think, honestly, there could be 40 plus in the English language, okay? But these are some of the most common ones, right? But so don't try to memorize them. Just try to understand that, these are the major types of prepositions. This is, words like within, whoops, that was terrible. Within, around, over, things that describe place or location usually, right? Those are prepositions, okay? And you never want to put a comma before or after a preposition, okay? So you can have a comma at the end of a prepositional phrase, but you can't have a comma, before the preposition of, after the preposition of, or any of these prepositions, okay? So if you ever see something like that, immediately mark it as wrong, okay? Okay, before or after the word that, number 6. This one shows up a lot, right? This is a kind of an ultra-specific one, and the reasoning behind it is a little bit wobbly, but the rule is sound, okay? You never want to put a comma before or after the word that, okay? That usually begins a new clause, usually a dependent clause, okay? And you don't want to put commas before a dependent clause, and you definitely don't want to separate that from the thing it's talking about, right? So the word that specifically, never put a comma before or after it, right? If you see the word that, immediately, no comma, okay? So yeah, there's also, when we talk in English, or when we write in English, we often omit the word that, right? When there's a hidden that or an optional that. For example, the snow that is used to build an igloo, or the snow used to build an igloo. Those two mean the same thing, but technically there should be a that is right here, okay? So grammatically, the snow used to build an igloo is totally fine, but there's a that there. So you definitely don't want to put a comma between the snow and used to build an igloo, especially when they're supposed to be that. Because if we put a that here, right, the comma would be next to that, and we know that's wrong. We never want to have that, okay? Number 7, between two adjectives whose order cannot be reversed, okay? This we talked about earlier, right? Stunning coral reefs, right? There's a lot of different examples, but coral reefs is a really good one because coral is describing the reefs. Stunning is describing the coral reefs as in total, right? So yeah, never put a comma between adjectives whose order cannot be reversed, okay, like this. Number 8, between adjectives and their nouns. Basically, when you have an adjective describing a noun, you don't separate the adjectives from the noun. That makes sense, right? There's a kind of theme with commas. You don't want to separate things that are connected, that link together, right? One describes the other. The subject is talking, or the subject is doing the verb. You don't separate them. The adjective is describing the noun. You don't want to separate them. That kind of thing, okay? And then the final one, this is pretty self-explanatory. Don't put a comma before an open parenthesis. So whenever we have a parenthesis in a sentence describing something or giving some context, you don't want to put a comma. Okay? Just keep that one in mind as well. So those are the 14 total grammar rules, 5 that tell you when to do a comma and 9 that tell you when not to put a comma, right? And those are probably the most difficult things on the English grammar exam, right? So if you were already super familiar with these, you should be set to go and get really into this English test. But if those were a little bit confusing, definitely go back and look at them. But the most important thing I should say is always just do more practice. Okay, let's keep on moving. We've got a couple more punctuation to talk about. The next one is colons. Okay, when are colons used? Colons are actually really simple. They might seem like a little bit complicated, but only 2 times colons can be used. Okay, number 1, colons are used to set up a list, right? If I want to say, I have a lot of things to buy at the grocery store, I would then say a colon and list those things in the that I need to get, okay? So whenever you see a sentence that sets up a natural list, right? On our trip, we visited these tourist attractions. Then set up a colon, museums, palaces, and monuments, okay? That's when we use a colon, right? To separate the sentence from the list it's describing, okay? And then the second time we use colons is before an explanation, right? So if you ever have a sentence, right, with 2 clauses, right? The first clause is then explained by the second clause. You say something and then you give an explanation for it. You can separate those clauses with the colon. For example, when the Manchus took control of China in 1644, the Great Wall ceased to have military significance. Why did it cease to have military significance? We put a colon. The empire now extended well north of the wall, and China's new enemies came from a different direction, across the sea. Okay? So we have this first sentence, describing, an occurrence, the fact that the Great Wall no longer has military significance. And then we have the second part that explains why it has no military significance, right? They no longer have threats from the north, right? That's why. Okay? All right. Dashes. Dashes are also kind of a unique one, right? Because they can act as colons in some ways and commas in other ways, okay? So they're kind of a mix of both, right? Dashes are used to indicate non-essential statements, right? So remember how we use comma, non-essential information, comma. We can also use dash, non-essential information, dash. Whoops, I should say dash. One thing I should note that students get wrong, incorrect a lot, is they see an answer choice that has a dash, non-essential information, and then a comma. That's not right. You can't mix and match a dash and a comma, right? You can't do that. What you can do is do a dash and a dash, or a comma and a comma to separate out non-essential information, but don't mix and match to get the correct answer, okay? Because that's not going to be right. All right. And then the second thing a dash can be used for is to set up a list or an explanation, right? So London has many tourist attractions. You could use a colon or you could use a dash, right? Museums, palaces, and monuments alike, okay? So these are the explanations or, the lists, right? Or you could use a dash or a colon. Either one works, okay? So dash is kind of it does a couple things. It can either act as a comma or a colon, okay? So those are the kind of big punctuation grammar rules that we have to go over, okay? We also should talk about the additional kind of grammar rules that the ACT loves to test on, okay? And some of these aren't, official English codified grammar rules. They're more of what's the best way to say things, right? And the ACT has described that in a couple of different ways here, and we'll talk about them, okay? First of all, the first big thing is wordiness and redundancy, okay? You never want to be redundant, right? The simplest answer is usually the best answer. Okay, what I mean by that is if I'm saying something, right, like the construction of the Great Wall was an enormous undertaking that occurred on a very large scale. That's repetitive, right? Enormous undertaking occurred on a very large scale. Those mean the same thing, right? Enormous undertaking means it is on a large scale, right? So we don't need to say both of them. We just need to pick one, right? So the correct answer here is going to be D, because we don't need to talk about large scale and an enormously huge. This is very redundant, very wordy, right? We want the simpler answer. Now, I should say the simplest answer is not always correct. The simplest answer that includes all of the necessary information, that's the correct answer, right? So you don't want to omit anything that's useful, right? But you definitely don't want to be redundant, right? So if we had, an enormous undertaking, right? That's important information. And if there was answer choice E that was like, it was just an, or just nothing, right? that might not be the best answer because we don't want to just completely get rid of the information they're giving us. We just don't want to be redundant, right? So we still want to do include the fact that it was a large scale and enormous undertaking, that kind of thing, okay? So that's wordiness and redundant. Don't be wordy, don't be redundant. That's pretty simple. Second thing is you want to talk about parallel structure. You want to maintain parallel structure. What is parallel structure? It's basically whenever you have a list of phrases, right? Phrases or examples or just words that are contributing to something, and they're in this kind of same list format, right? You want to have them have the same format, the same structure. Basically, if you're listing nouns that are part of a bigger group, you want to have noun, noun, noun. Or you want to have a word that ends in ing, and then the next one ends in ing, and the next one ends in ing, right? You don't want to mix and match nouns and verbs and descriptors and phrases. You want to keep this kind of parallel structure along this list. Okay, for example, deception expert Pamela Meyer has collaborated with a team of researchers to survey and analyze existing research on lying from academics, law enforcement officers, and psychologists. These are all, names, nouns, types of, professions. Okay. Well, that's correct, right? Because that's the same correct parallel structure. Now, if I was to say academics, law enforcement officers, and working as psychologists, that doesn't make much sense because working as psychologists, that's a verb, that's a gerund, right? It's describing an action, right? Whereas these are just nouns, right? So you don't want to switch it up midway through the list, right? You want to maintain the same structure, noun, 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 or verb, 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 okay? So this one is going to be correct because we have the same noun, noun, noun format, whereas we have noun, noun, and then working as psychologists, that's a descriptor, that's a verb, okay? Okay, so let's move on. So the same is true when there are only two items joined by and or but. Note that when parallel structure involves infinitives, it is not necessary to repeat the to after the first verb. This one doesn't really show up that much, right? But you don't need to say to survey and to analyze, right? You can just say to survey and analyze, right? But with parallel structure, remember to survey and analyzing, those are different formats of a verb, right? This is the gerund form and this is the infinitive. You want to maintain the same type, right? To survey and analyze is correct. To survey and analyzing, that's incorrect, okay? Maintain that parallel structure. Okay, the next thing we talk about is subject-verb agreement. Students really often get this one incorrect, so let's go through it, correct, okay? Basically, whenever you have a verb or a noun, if they're talking about singular something, the noun is singular, the verb better be singular too, right? We don't want to switch up singular and plural. For example, let's see, illegal logging in Mexican forests have resulted in the destruction of the monarch butterfly's habitat. Okay, have is plural, right? They have done something. They is plural, have is plural. So have is the plural version of has, right? But illegal logging is the noun that have is referring to, right? Illegal logging have resulted in destruction of monarch butterfly's habitat. We see this as incorrect because illegal logging is singular. Logging is singular. That's a single action, right? If it was loggings, like this, loggings, that's plural, and then we could use have. But we don't want to do that because logging is singular, right? So we use the word has instead, the singular version, okay? Also be on the lookout for compound subjects, right? Two singular subjects connected by an and are actually plural, right? For example, the monarch and red admiral, those are two, types of butterflies, monarch and red admiral, are among the most common butterfly species in North America. We're using are instead of is because monarch and red admiral, there's two of them, that makes it plural, right? So we want to use are instead of is there. Okay, so basically the idea here is make sure your subject and your verb agree in plurality. Basically, is it plural? Is it singular? Your verb better be the same as your noun, okay? And the thing that's difficult for a lot of students is really being able to figure out what noun is referring to what verb, right? Or what verb is referring to what noun, right? So even though in Mexican forests is in between them, right? Have and illegal logging, that's the connection we care about. It's not Mexican forests have resulted in the destruction of the monarch. It's the logging that does that resulting, right? So we have to be very careful about which noun we're actually referring to, which noun is the subject of the sentence. Okay, so don't get tripped up by putting with the prepositional phrases or the non-essential information between the subject and verb. For example, in Mexican forests, remember prepositional phrase describes location or place. In, that's context, that's a place, location, right? That's a prepositional phrase, and we can basically just get rid of it, right? It provides a little bit extra context, but it doesn't kill the meaning of our sentence, right? It doesn't kill the meaning of our sentence. Okay, so although it is sometimes difficult to see which noun, right? A good practice is if you ever see a prepositional phrase after a subject, right? Cross out the prepositional phrase and then read the sentence. And then the sentence becomes much more clear that has is referring to illegal logging, right? The subject would be illegal logging. This also works with non-essential clauses, right? The cochineal, a small insect discovered by Hernan Cortez in present-day Mexico in 1519, all that information I just underlined, that's non-essential, right? So the sentence really is the cochineal were commonly used as colorant in painting, right? So that's the real sentence, right? This is all just extra information we can cross out, and then we have to figure out, okay, cochineal, that's singular, were, that's plural, so that's wrong, right? So instead, we're going to switch were to was, the singular version, right? It was versus they were, okay? So remember, don't get tripped up by subject-verb agreement, okay? Always be careful to identify what the verb and the noun actually is, okay? These are a couple of other errors to know. You should look through these, right? But these aren't super important, okay? Next thing we have to talk about is pronoun agreement, okay? So pronoun agreement. Basically, the pronoun must agree with the noun that it's referring to. Just like the subject-verb agreement, you have to have agreement between singular and plural versions of pronouns and nouns. For example, painter Frida Kahlo was best known for her portraits. They were strongly influenced by indigenous Mexican culture, as revealed by her use of bright colors and dramatic symbolism. They were, right? That's a pronoun and a verb, right? They were, because they're referring to portraits, right? They is referring to portraits, and the portraits are plural. It's multiple portraits, right? Therefore, we have to use they, not it, and were, not was, right? So be very careful with pronouns and their agreement with the noun, right? The hardest thing for a lot of students is figuring out what word the pronoun is referring to, right? Try to substitute the words, right? And use context, right? Even if I just read they were, I can't really think about what they're talking about, right? But if I notice strongly influenced by indigenous Mexican culture revealed by her use of bright colors and dramatic symbolism, it's very clear that they is now referring to portraits, okay? So that's going to be our correct answer. Next thing we have to talk about is verb tense, okay? The most important thing here is tense consistency, okay? I mentioned in the last video that you should always be reading the entire English test. You should always be reading the entire passage, not just the questions and their associated sentences, right? So always be reading the whole test. And because of that, you need tense consistency. Basically, if the passage is talking in past tense, you don't want a sentence to just suddenly start talking in present tense and then switch back to past, right? So sometimes the correct answer comes from the information in the rest of the passage, not just the information that you're seeing in that sentence, okay? So definitely get the context. Keep tense consistent, right? Was combined, right? She was best known. She is strongly influenced. That's not true. Is present. Was combined or past, right? We want to make sure it's consistent. Was combined. That makes more sense, okay? So another correct, this is kind of a quick tip for you that you can read, not super important, not always the case either. But the second thing that verb tense we care about is past perfect versus present perfect, right? You should have some familiarity with these. They're helpful to use, right? Present perfect is just has or have plus a verb, right? It describes an action, right? Italy and France have been tourist attractions for hundreds of years since the 18th century. Okay, so basically what this is saying is it's describing an action that begins in the past and continues into the present, right? If you ever see the word for or since, right, that's describing something that started in the past and is still going on today, right? That's when we use the present perfect, right? Italy and France have been tourist attractions for hundreds of years, right? It's not Italy and France are tourist attractions for hundreds of years, right? It's have been. Okay, so that's what the present perfect is. And then the past perfect is very similar. It's not has or have, it's had. Had is when you do something starting in the past and then it's completed in the past as well, right? So it occurred some period of time in the past, right? And it ended in the past as well. For example, by the time Mae Jemison became an astronaut, she had studied science for many years. So, this is the ending of her studying of science because she becomes an astronaut, right? And had studied, that's the past perfect, right? Had implies she was doing it and then she became an astronaut, okay? That was kind of the idea with past perfect. Okay, so just being familiar with this is very helpful, right? Understanding the difference between just she studied versus she had studied, okay? Understand that when there's an action that requires this perfect tense, right? Make sure you're using the right verb, okay? Rather than just studied, we need had studied, okay? Adjectives and adverbs, okay? So this is kind of an old packet, right? So this is still the case. The difference between an adjective and adverb is not super important anymore, right? You just basically need to know adverb or adjectives describe nouns, okay? And adverbs modify verbs. Basically, they end in ly usually, right? She was quickly running, right? Running is a verb. Quickly describes how fast she was running, so it's describing the verb, okay? So, just make sure you understand the difference between an adjective and an adverb. You don't really need to care about these comparatives and superlatives here. If you want to read through it to increase your English grammar knowledge in general, certainly, but that's not what the ACT is about, right? So we're going to focus on the stuff that actually shows up on the ACT today in 2025. Okay, number 7, so this is the 7th thing in these, additional grammar rules, word pairs. When one of these pairs of words appears in a sentence, the other must appear as well, right? If we see the word neither, you're going to expect nor. Or if you see the word either, you're going to expect or, right? Also, one big thing, the word as never shows up without another as. As is comparing something, right? As is used to compare one thing to another. So you need to use as twice, right? You need to compare, say, it's as big as something else or something like that, right? So whenever you see one as, you need a second as. This trips up students a lot. One of my favorite questions of all time, and by favorite, I mean the most difficult ACT questions of all time, showed up with an as. The correct answer had 2 as's, and the incorrect answer that was most student selection, something like 70%, chose just something that had 1 as in it. Okay, it's very difficult to identify sometimes, but be careful. Whenever you see 1 as, there is going to be a second one. Okay, same thing with not only but also, right? These word pairs appear, the other must appear as well. Who, which, and whom. Okay, so who versus whom. Basically, we're just going to be talking about this major format. There is a real, rule behind when you use whom's, direct object versus indirect object, right? But let's just talk about the 3 major rules that are kind of easy for a lot of students to memorize, right? Number 1, whom refers to people, which refers to things. We talked about this already. We don't need to go over it again. Number 2, whom is used before a verb. That's incorrect. If you ever have something before a verb, right, and it's referring to a person, the pronoun of a person, we should use the word who, not whom, right? Who earned renown for her portraits, right? Frida Kahlo was an artist who earned renown for her portraits. You don't use whom, right? If you have a verb, you identify that. If you're checking who versus whom, it's always going to be who, not whom, okay? If it's right before a preposition, though, right before a preposition, like the word many artists, right? You do need to use the word whom, okay? So whom basically comes before prepositions, and who comes before verbs, okay? So keep those 2 things in mind, right? Definitely get some practice with those, but they're going to be very useful for, later ACT questions, okay? Number 9, modification, dangling and misplaced modifiers. Okay, you might have heard these in an English class before about a misplaced modifier or a dangling modifier. What these basically are is problems. They occur when you're using a modifier, an adjective, or a phrase that describes something else, and then it's dislocated in the sentence. Basically, you have a noun, and then way later in the sentence, or way earlier in a previous sentence, or something like that, the modifier is used describing that noun, right? Modifiers should always be placed as close as possible to the thing, noun, verb, whatever they're modifying. For example, right? Born in Mexico City in 1907, Frida Kahlo was best known for her self-portraits. Born in Mexico City in 1907, that's a modifier. It's describing Frida Kahlo. It should be very close to Frida Kahlo, right? Separated just by a comma right there, right? Incorrect, however. Born in Mexico City in 1907, self-portraits were what Frida Kahlo was best known for. That's incorrect, right? Because although we as humans can identify that a self-portrait was not born in 1907, Frida Kahlo was born in 1907, right? Grammatically, this phrase, this modifier, is referring to the closest noun, self-portraits. That doesn't make sense, right? We know it's referring to Frida Kahlo, but grammatically it's incorrect, okay? So keep those two things in mind, right? Dangling modifiers, misplaced modifier. Whenever the modifier is in the incorrect place in the sentence, right, we need it to be as close as possible to the noun we're referring to, okay? Dangling modifiers occur at the beginning of a sentence, right? Misplaced modifiers are just whenever that same modifier is somewhere else in the sentence, not the beginning. Just kind of fancy nomenclature, okay? Either way, make sure you know that you should put the modifier right next to the noun, okay? Misplaced modifier, same thing here, okay? Pronoun case. Let's talk about pronoun case. When pronoun case is tested, it will always be plural. Basically, usually it shows up as a proper name plus a pronoun. This one really doesn't show up that much anymore, right? It's a little bit older, but it's important to check out, a couple of differences here. For example, last year, my mother and I attended the Gathering of Nations, the largest annual meeting of Native Americans in the United States. The incorrect thing is mother and me. That's wrong. And the way we can check that is by crossing out the proper name beforehand, right? So it usually shows up with mother and me or sister and I or something like that, right? Cross out the other thing and just use the pronoun. Cross out the proper noun, just use the pronoun and see whether it still makes sense. Last year, me attended the Gathering of Nations. Clearly that's incorrect. Last year, I attended the Gathering of Nations. That's the correct one. So the whole phrase should be my mother and I, okay? So that's a little bit of a trick to figure out whether these pronoun cases are correct. Usually these don't show up. I've seen this very rarely on the ACT, but it does show up and it's good for you to understand, okay? And then another thing we have to know is a couple of idioms in diction, right? So could have, should have, would have, might have. It's not could have, should have, would have, might have, okay? Keep those in mind because a lot of people when saying it, right, say could have, right? They're actually saying could have, but it sounds like could have, and a lot of students start to mix that up over time, okay? So it's could have or should have, would have, might have, okay? Another thing is the difference between than and then. Than is talking about a comparison, right? Similar to the word as. You are bigger than, or no, the balloon was bigger than a truck, okay? Then is comparing the size of these two things. Then is saying one thing happened, then another thing happened. So an A is talking about comparison. It acts as an as. That's a good way to remember it if you want. And then is a sequence of events. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference there. Be careful. Okay. There's a lot of other types of, diction. There's no real rule that you can use to figure it out, but then versus then is one of the biggest ones. Okay. And if anybody wants to put a recommendation for, what I can briefly talk about it in the next video. Any, questions you've gotten wrong about this type of diction between then versus than or something else like that, I can discuss that rule with you, but there's just so many of them we just can't cover it in the time, right? So let's keep going. We're going to go to our last final page, right? Talking about transitions, okay? So questions testing transitions are more about meaning than grammar. The transition has to imply, just like we talked about with the word however, moreover, therefore, the transition has to match the two things we're talking about, right? For example, the obvious reason for the construction of the Great Wall of China was protection. Blank, China had no powerful enemies at the time construction first began. So these two things are contradictory. They are opposing ideas, right? So we could use the word but or however, right? We don't want to use the word since because since is something like therefore or moreover as a result, right? Since is a because kind of thing where you have one thing logically makes sense because of this other thing, right? That's not what we have here. We have two ideas, right? Construction was for protection. but there was no need to be protected, right? Those are contradictory, and therefore we need to use a contradictor, like the word since or however. Okay. Finally, if there's an omit or delete option or an option without a transition, check that option first. This one is usually just a time saver. I would say if you have to guess on a question, you shouldn't have to, but if you are running out of time and you see an omit or a delete, guess that one, because that's usually correct on the ACT. By usually, we mean about 40% of the time, right? More than 25, like it would be for a normal question with 4 answer choices. But this can be helpful if you're in a crunch for time or anything like that. Okay. And then the final tip here is when 2 transitions have the same meaning, but they are both grammatically acceptable in context, both can automatically be eliminated. This same kind of rule applies to a bunch of things for the English test, right? When you have 2 sentences that are exactly the same grammatically, right? They both can't be right. For example, if you use but or yet, and that's the only difference, they're both better be wrong because they both can't be right, right? You also can't use, if 2 sentences are differ only by a period versus a semicolon, right? Those 2 mean the exact same thing, like we discussed earlier. Therefore, both of them can't be right, and both of them better be wrong, right? So that's the kind of final trick we need to talk about with the English test. And that's actually going to be it for today's lesson. So we finished up the ACT Prep course lesson 2. So what we reviewed today was the English grammar packet. Right? So we went through all of that. Definitely take a look at it, review it yourself as well. Come back to this video if you need a little bit more explanation on it, okay? But review it yourself. Try to memorize as many of the rules as you can. Start using them, right? Memorization on the test isn't going to be super helpful. It's going to be about having them ingrained in your mind, in your memory, okay? So keep those in mind. Our next video, right? Our next video is going to be lesson 3, which is going to be taking us through an English test. Okay, so we're going to start applying these rules to English questions. You're going to see how I take an English test to try to maximize my score, right? And it's going to hopefully give you some tips on how you should be practicing, how you should be taking English tests. Okay? Thanks for coming. I will see you next time. Hopefully you were a little bit more engaged with my video today. I tried to interact with the camera a little bit more. I'll do better next time. We'll see how it goes, okay? I'll see you next time.